Hello and welcome to the 2022 South Dakota Emerald Ash Borer Update. My name is Tony Seidel. I'll be acting as your moderator for today's workshop. This workshop is another in a series of virtual presentations focused on forest health in South Dakota, with our goal to inform landowners and decision makers about current and local tree care trends. Today, South Dakota's forest health specialist, Dr. John Ball, will discuss the status of the non-native emerald ash borer in our state. Now, this workshop is being recorded, and the recording will be placed on the department's YouTube channel for public viewing once reviewed by the department's technical support team. All participant microphones have been turned off, and due to bandwidth concerns, we request that your mics and videos stay off during the presentation. The department is an equal opportunity provider, and we encourage participation. We plan to have a few minutes at the end of the presentation for questions, and should some questions arise while Dr. Ball has the floor, please place those in the chat box and we'll do our best to get them at the end of our workshop. Now, we do also have Society of American Forester and ISA credits available for attending this live workshop. So if you would please, and if you are interested, type your credentials for your respective certification in the chat box now. And while our guests are entering their credentials, Dr. Ball, I'll let you have the floor. You want to share your screen?
All right. Oops. All right. Well, thanks, Tony. And we'll get it started here. Again, my name is John Ball. I'm professor of forestry at South Dakota State University, but I'm also the forest health specialist for the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources. And today we're going to be talking about emerald ash borer. And kind of a key thing here is that if you have an ash in your yard, they're zombie trees, that we are going to lose them all eventually in the state. Now, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a couple of decades, in fact, to roll across the entire state. But nevertheless, it is moving, and it's a good time to be aware of what's going to happen, particularly if you're at the east end of the state or in the hills. We expect it to arrive in the Black Hills sooner than the middle part of the state. Why? Because people cut down trees and bring them as firewood, and they'll take them out to the hills. Any vacation spots probably going to be sooner on the list rather than later. This was a slide I used in a presentation back in 2004. The insect had just been discovered in the United States, July of 2002, and it was found in ash in southeastern Michigan, Canton Township, interesting enough. And they thought at the time it had been there since 97. They now think it had been there since 93. So it had been there for almost 10 years before anyone was aware what it was. And in that time, it killed about 8 million trees, 2 million in that last year just before they found it. The interesting thing, and this is again what Michigan was suggesting way back about 20 years ago, that they're suggesting you plant something other than ash, which is certainly what we're doing. And they found that about 25% of all their street trees were ash. That's pretty close to South Dakota. Some of our communities are actually 33 to 40%. Now, we do have some that are less than that, but if you think about a third of all the trees in a community being ash, you're pretty close to right. And they expect to lose all of them in Michigan, which they did more or less, but I'll explain that story here in a moment. And again, there is no resistance. At the time, treatments were expensive, but those costs have dropped as technology's improved. And they also mentioned, again, 20 years ago, that it was a wake-up call to diversify the landscape. That's been something we've been promoting since 2004. The fact that we need to get more trees out there than just one particular species or a genus. And unfortunately, in South Dakota, we have ash-lined streets. You can find them just about anywhere in the state, entire streets covered with ash. Now, some communities are already in the process of a preemptive removal in anticipation of the arrival of EAB to their town. City of Sioux Falls has been doing this now for 4 years, and they're doing an excellent job of trying to slightly get ahead of the losses. as again, their trees are infested to a large degree. Want to point out, where do we have it right now? Where do we have it confirmed? And that's a key word. Where have we confirmed it? You know, people say, well, where is it? Well, we don't know. By that, we mean it could be in communities no one's seen it yet. I mean, it is kind of stealthy. But Sioux Falls is where we first found it in 2018. And then in 2020, also in the spring, by the way, it was May of 2018 for Sioux Falls. It was May of 2020 for finding the population in Canton. And about June, we found a small population at the edge of Worthing. And then a week ago, again in May, but 2022, excuse me, found a population just outside of Crooks. So we have, I'd call it 4 distinct populations, though obviously Sioux Falls is a rather large area. You can go into areas of Sioux Falls and you won't even see the beetle yet. And you can go into areas where they've seriously injured a lot of trees. We've already seen a few trees die from it. And if you go to Canton, you'll see the same thing, only a little bit more accelerated. It seems the smaller the town, the faster the beetle will move through it. So we know we have 4 distinct populations. Undoubtedly, there's a few more out there. It seems that people start noticing them at this time of year. So I imagine we'll come up with a couple more before the end of this year. Well, let's take a look at mortality, 10-year mortality. If you look at green ash, any green ash, doesn't matter if it's a Patmore green ash, a Summit green ash, whatever cultivar you have, or even just the species green ash, the 10-year mortality, in other words, once we find the beetle in your community, is about 100%. I mean, we're going to lose virtually all of them in a town once we find EAB in there, unless they're treated, of course. We're going to lose 100% of our black ash. Now, black ash was hit by canker disease probably about 15 years ago. So we've already thinned that population quite a bit. But the ones that are left, they have no resistance to this insect, no tolerance. And we'll lose 100% of those within 10 years of finding it in the community. Notice for white ash, and again, it doesn't matter which white ash. This is Northern Blaze and Rapid City. But we'll lose 98% within 10 years. And you might say, well, wait a minute, that means 2% of them are going to live, but not that long. We're going to still lose them. Here I took this picture down near the original discovery of emerald ash borer in the summer of 2002. Now, I took this picture a few years ago, and what I'm showing you here is all ash coming back after the infestation killed all the mature ash in that township. And you look, and it is a thicket of ash. And I've been following these trees, and here's a good example. Here's what we call lingering ash. And I took this picture in Southfield, Michigan. That's a little to the north of Canton Township. Canton Township's kind of on the south side of Detroit. This is on the northwest side of Detroit. And I took this picture in 2017, and take a look at that white ash. And if you look at it, trunk looks pretty good. And you're thinking, wow, white ash, some white ash might make it. We call them lingering ash. Unfortunately, there's the same tree. And I took that picture in a few weeks ago, actually a couple of months ago now. I think I took it in January when I was checking the trees again. And so even they can linger on for a while, but eventually they die. In fact, what's quite interesting, if you go back to Michigan, you'll find that the green ash live to about 5 inches, and then they're killed. But they're big enough to seed. So in other words, ash is becoming a shrub in the woods out there, and even further east. It gets big enough to produce seed, so it perpetuates itself, but then it's attacked and killed by emerald ash borer. So the point is, once emerald ash borer is found in a community, it'll always be in a community. It'll survive in all those sprouts that come up in every alleyway, every ditch, and every shelter belt and other wooded area. I was in New York just about 2 weeks ago, looking at emerald ash borer. And as you can see here, I got my hand around about a 2+ inch tree, and it still looks fine. But by the time they get that size, you can see the difference. They're all infested. So when people tell you, well, I've heard some that survive, well, there's probably one out there, but that's a pretty small pool. And again, the problem is they'll survive for a while, enough that they'll produce seed and then be killed by emerald ash borer. So, people say, well, once it goes through a community, they'll all die out. No, they won't. There'll be a smaller population that will persist indefinitely. Because as I say, what's happened is ash has become a shrub. This is coming up in the Chicago area. As you can see, an alleyway next to a house. But they'll get large enough to seed before they're finally killed by the emerald ash borer. Well, what about the Manchurian ash? Take a look at that, about 2% mortality. Now, the reason for that is Manchurian ash is native to northeastern China, and that's where emerald ash borer is from. And obviously it makes sense. If it was going to kill off all its hosts, it would have long since died as well. But emerald ash borer and the Asian ash have reached a compromise. As long as the ash remains healthy, the emerald ash borer cannot kill it. So emerald ash borer in China is doing what it's supposed to do. It's taking trees that are declining for one of many reasons and then quickly recycling them. The problem is when emerald ash borer arrived in this country, it recognized our ash as suitable hosts, but our ash have very little resistance to this insect and almost no tolerance to it. And so they're fairly easily killed. Now you might think, well, the solution then is just to plant all the Asian ash. But unfortunately, there's a flip side to this. Even though they have chemicals in them that help fight off emerald ash borer as long as they're healthy, and our ash do not, the Manchurian ash is very susceptible to our native clearwing ash borer. Here's a fairly large Manchurian ash in Sioux Falls, South Dakota that was flat out killed by our clearwing ash borer. Our clearwing ash borer attacks our native ash and will kill them if they're stressed. But it will kill this tree because, again, it's the reverse. So when you say, well, let's just go out and plant Manchurian ash, for example, it's not a bad idea to plant some, but I'll tell you, they're not drought tolerant. And if we have a drought and they're not being irrigated, they'll be easily attacked and killed by our clearwing ash borer. So unfortunately, the long-term prospects of planting any ash is fairly minimal. Let's take a look at some signs and symptoms for emerald ash borer. What do you want to be looking for? And we'll go over some of the best ways to determine whether a tree may be infested. The first is look for thinning canopies. Now, here's a tree that had been infested for about 2 years, maybe 2 going on to 3. And if you'll notice, the upper part of the canopy, the leaves are smaller than normal and lighter than normal. What happens is the beetle, as it's tunneling beneath the bark along the trunk and large branches there, is severing the connection that's carrying the sugars produced by the leaves throughout the rest of the tree, the stem, and the roots. And so you'll find a portion of that canopy where it's really being impacted is not getting enough water. The leaves are going to be smaller than normal, and since we need water to bring up all the nutrients, they're going to be lighter than green than normal. So just dieback is not a way of determining whether a tree is emerald ash borer. We have a lot of ash that just have dieback just because of the drought. But if you see something like this, that's an indicator that it may be infested with emerald ash borer. It's thinning canopies, not just discrete dieback. Another one is Epicormic shoots. These small shoots that come up along the branches in the stem. Now, this is a general reaction to stress. In other words, it'll do this for ice damage, for example. If the canopy's busted up, it'll do it for droughts in some cases. But nevertheless, in South Dakota, we see this associated with emerald ash borer almost all the time. Other states have not. But in South Dakota, yes, epicormic shoots are very common on trees that are infested by emerald ash borer. and likewise suckers, sprouts coming up along the base. Now, again, these can occur if the tree's been hit with a lawnmower or other stresses. But on our trees that are infested with emerald ash borer, we do find thinning canopies, epicormic shoots, sprouts coming up along the branches, and suckers around the base. All three of these are pretty good indicators that that tree may be infested. Number 4 is vertical splits. We usually don't get bark splitting on ash as we do maples, for example. But if you look at some of the lower branches or even the trunk on a smaller tree, a tree less than about 8 inches diameter, you might find a split in it. And if you pull that split away, you'll see where a gallery was. Because what happens is it kills the tissue around its tunneling. Since that tissue's dead, that bark is also dead. And now as the trunk expands, the dead bark cannot expand, and we end up with a slit. And if you really stick a knife into that slit there, you're going to find what I call the Superman galleries, because they kind of resemble our Superman symbol. And what it is these serpentine galleries going back and forth, and they'll be filled with powder, what we call frass. And this is another indicator that the tree may be infested with emerald ash borer. Now notice I'm still saying may, because occasionally our red-headed ash borer and our banded ash borer will also make serpentine galleries in a somewhat healthy tree. So this is a good indicator, but it doesn't confirm it yet. Of course, now I can look at the insect, and that'll confirm who made those Superman galleries. The emerald ash borer is a flat-headed borer, and so you'll find the larvae are even flat. That's not a rounded larvae. It's kind of a creamy white. It's in bell-shaped segments, and at the very rear of it, it has these 2 small pinchers. So bell-shaped segments on an insect that's anywhere from 1/5 of an inch to 1.5 inches long, depending on the season. At the end of these serpentine galleries, that is emerald ash borer. We're done now. That is an agralis, and this is the most common agralis that attacks ash, though we do have one other one around. Our native banded ash borer, as you can see here, it also made serpentine galleries in this case because it attacked a fairly healthy host. Normally these go for dead trees, recently dead or dying trees. But if you look at the larvae there, the head, the prothorax right behind the head capsule, is much enlarged, and these are the Michelin man segments rather than bell-shaped. They're kind of rounded. And so it doesn't appear like an emerald ash borer. So identifying the larvae is actually relatively easy. And the adult to our banded ash borer is much different. As you can see here, it's a little bit larger beetle, and it has these nice kind of white or sometimes light yellow circles and bands on the wing covers, the elytra. Now, by the way, I can find them both in the same tree, and I got this picture because I was pulling bark away from a ash tree infested by emerald ash borer, and the adult landed on the tree. And I could find the larvae of the banded ash borer on it as well. So nothing says that a ash tree can only be infested by one insect. Probably one of the best, just standing back and looking at a tree. You might say, well, it's declined a little bit. I see sprouts, but looking for blonding, which is a result of woodpecker activity. The outer bark on ash really has a couple layers to it. And that outer layer is easily broken off and kind of reveals a smoother layer below it and a little bit lighter colored. So we refer to that as blonding. And woodpeckers will do that as they're going along the bark, drilling in, looking for the emerald ash borer. You'll find woodpeckers on the trees that are infested. Now, what's interesting, that when emerald ash borer first shows up in a community, the woodpeckers haven't quite figured it out yet. Once they figure out that this is a new food source, then you're going to see blonding. But in a community that it's relatively new to, you're not going to find that yet. The woodpeckers haven't figured out this is a pretty tasty meal that's easy for them to extract. Once they do, they go after them with a vengeance. If you find blonded area, such as this, where you find that drill hole into it, and you pull the bark away from it, as I'm going to do here, you find a gallery stopped. In other words, they got it. They listen for them underneath the bark. And since emerald ash borer just tunnels just beneath the bark, it's pretty easy to reach for a woodpecker. And they are spot on. Every time I find a drill, when I pull the bark away, I'll find where a gallery stopped. Now you might say, well, hey, now we got control. Nah, they still only get about 30% of them in a tree. And so we're going to get an awful lot that are still going to continue to live and become adults and fly away and lay eggs and repeat the cycle again. So woodpeckers are a good way of telling us where it is. It's not a good way to control the insect. Now, by the way, blonding can be the result of just anything scampering along the bark. And one of our big scampers out there are squirrels. And I've looked at many an ash tree with what appears to be a lot of blonding, as you see in this picture. And you look up, yep, there's squirrel nests up there. Yep, you find bird feeders hanging from the tree. And if you look close at all that blonded area, you won't find a single drill hole. And so in that case, what you're looking at are squirrels. And I get a lot of calls. In fact, this last weekend, spring here, I was out looking at some ash that someone said, well, I think these have emerald ash borer. And the single clue was the blonding. There was no epicormic shoots. There was no sprouting. Last summer, they didn't see any thinning in the canopy. And frankly, the canopies looked pretty good. They hadn't leafed out yet, but they still looked good. But yes, there was blonding. But there was also squirrel nests, and there wasn't a single drill in any of the blonding that I looked at. So keep in mind, we've got Rocky out there too that's causing little damage. And that's what Rocky did, for example. You can see it pulled away that outer bark layer. So we have that blonding, but you don't see a single drill hole in any of this. The last is looking for D-shaped holes. The adults emerge out of a characteristic D-shaped hole. It's a very crisp D-shaped. If you look at it, it's a distinct D. You'll have no doubt in your mind when you look at it. If you look at it and you say, you know, I'm not sure if that's a D or not, it's probably not. But we have a lot of other insects, and they'll make holes that are round and oval, and a lot of them are usually larger than the D-shaped hole to the EAB, emerald ash borer. I'll also mention that you're not going to find that D-shaped hole lower on the trunk, in other words, where you can easily see it, until the tree is just about dead. They start in the upper canopy, it's sunlit up there, and they kind of work their way down on the tree over the years. In fact, the emerald ash borer tends to lay eggs on the same tree it came out of, if that tree has any life in it whatsoever. So it just keeps kind of recycling into that tree for about 4 years until it finally dies from the repeated infestations. But if you're able to look at D-shaped holes at eye level, that's a dead tree, or so close to death, you might as well cut it down. Well, let's take a look at their life cycle, and the life cycle that we're seeing here in South Dakota now. First of all, if we take a look in June, coming up here, in July, that's when the first instar larvae appear. Now, the larvae goes through 4 instars, in other words, 4 stages of development. And you can see when they first emerge from their eggs, look at how little they are, about 1/4 of an inch, even 1/5 of an inch. So they're very small, and they make this kind of threaded gallery. Again, still that serpentine Superman gallery, but it's just kind of right on the top of the inner bark, what we call the phloem. It's really not doing a lot of damage yet, but it's going to continue to mature. And we'll also see the second instar, which is now about 2/5 of an inch long. Notice here again that they're kind of almost on the phloem tissue, on the inner bark, rather than in it. So they're not causing a lot of disruption. In other words, we're still getting some movement of food through that tissue where they've got their galleries running through. And we'll find a lot of the second instar in late June and certainly into July. The third instars occur in July and August. They're about 3/4 of an inch. And now they're so big, they're cutting through the entire phloem. In other words, that layer of tissue that's moving the sugars from the canopy of the tree through to the roots, the trunk, and all the other parts of the tree that need that food. They're severing it completely. And in fact, they're even etching the sapwood. They're so wide. And that outer layer sapwood is where ash moves water. So the larger emerald ash borer larvae that are in the tree are severing that connection that's moving the food, and they're even disrupting a little bit of the water movement through the tree as well. And then by August into September, we're now into the fourth instar. And these are extremely big, about an inch, inch and a quarter. I've seen them as big as an inch and a half. And they're plowing through the tree. So they're doing a tremendous amount of damage when they get to this size. Now, by the end of September, they're done feeding. Okay, that's it. And now they're getting ready for their long winter nap. And now they're going to burrow into the sapwood. So why emerald ash bore's feeding? It's just beneath the bark in what we call the inner bark or phloem. But for the winter, it's going to go a little deeper into the sapwood. And in that sapwood, they're going to cut what we call an overwintering chamber. And they're going to curl around themselves, kind of like a cat getting ready to take a nap. And they'll spend the winter as what we call a J-shaped larvae, kind of a pre-pupae. Just before this resting stage. Since they're in the sapwood a little deeper, they're a little bit better protected from the winter cold. And also at this time of year, late October, November, if you pull the bark away from the tree, you won't find any of them. You literally got to scrape through a gallery. You'll see where they took a little dive deeper, and you keep scraping and you'll end up revealing that overwintering chamber. And you'll see that little J-shaped larvae inside. Now, in April, it's going to kind of unfold itself and become a little bit more cylindrical. So they're not going to be flat anymore. They're going to be cylindrical. And this is the start of pupation, the resting stage before becoming an adult. This is what they look like right now in South Dakota, in the areas where we have the infestation, the Sioux Falls, greater Sioux Falls area, I guess I'd call it. They start out as white, kind of as a blob, and then they start having features, kind of like the wing pads to it, and they start to darken, as you can see here. It's just starting, the head capsules starting to darken here, but I mean, you can make out that you're looking at an insect here rather than a blob. And it's going to take it about another 2 weeks for that to darken completely and really take the form of an adult. The adults will sit under there for a few days. And then they'll work their way out a hole that was previously cut last fall. And the adults then will emerge from that chamber. And here's an adult coming out. And again, it's going to cut that D-shaped hole at it. Now, they begin emerging in late May at about 550 growing degree days, base 50. In South Dakota, that's timed well with black locusts in bloom. When the black locusts begin to flower, we're going to start seeing these little insects begin to fly. And so June is where I can find the adults. They'll literally light on the trunks. If you stand very still, you can actually get a picture of them as they're there. They're kind of that copper emerald green. If you make any movement, they'll fly away very quickly, or sometimes they'll actually fold their legs and drop as a way of getting away from you. They do like sunny locations. They like to fly when the air temperature is about 80 degrees. On days where we don't have a lot of wind, and they like midday on a sunny day, low 80s, south sides of trees, up in the upper canopy with their sunlight, you can find these insects very easily. And here's a good example of one. Now the eggs they lay just underneath bark flakes, and these eggs are extremely tiny. You need a microscope to really be able to look at them. The one egg there was parasitized. The egg at the top is actually looking pretty good. The females can lay about 80 eggs, and it kind of lays them in clusters, but the eggs are laid where there's the roughest bark. And that's why you'll often find that the gallery start right where a branch union is to the trunk, because we have a lot of rough bark in that area. And that's a good place for mom to kind of scoot underneath the bark flake and lay a number of eggs. The eggs take about 2 weeks before they hatch. By the way, mom has to feed on leaves for a couple of weeks before she lays eggs. So that's why I say in June, we start having them fly. We really don't see egg hatch until really towards the end of June in South Dakota. So if you look at the adult flying, and we've been tracking this for the last 4 years, when black locust is in bloom, that's the beginning of the season, about 550 growing degree days. In late June, about the time little leaf linden is in bloom, somewhere about 800 to 1,000 growing degree days, then we've hit peak emergence. In other words, half of them have coming out now. All right, they're out. The tail of that is a lot quicker than the other side coming up. And usually by early July, about the time hydrangeas start to bloom, we've really gone through a lot of the emergence. We'll have a few still emerging in late July, a couple even into early August. When the adult's life cycle is about 4 weeks. And so for us, the last adult is pretty much gone by Labor Day. So for us in South Dakota, the bookends to the flight period of emerald ash borer is Memorial Day to Labor Day. And really the bulk of the egg laying is going to be around 4th of July. Figure about a week or two before it and a week or two after it. And so that's where we're going to see most of them out there laying eggs. Well, what kills emerald ash borer? We certainly want to get rid of the little guys and gals. So what kills them? Well, first of all, there are natural enemies, parasitoids, for example, insects that lay their young in this insect, and then they devour it and emerge. That's responsible for about 20% of the mortality. You might think that's a big number, not for an insect that lays as many eggs as this one, but nevertheless, it helps. But what's happened is once emerald ash borer became established in this country, researchers went overseas to China, looking at areas where they have this insect and what feeds on them. And they've brought those insects back, rearing them in I'll call it the greater Detroit area. And now they're being released. And APHIS in South Dakota is responsible for the releases, and we've been assisting them. But here a good example is an egg parasitoid. And what that little insect will do is it'll take that little thread, what we call an ovipositor, and stick that in the eggs, pump eggs into the emerald ash borer egg. Those eggs will hatch, and they'll essentially have an omelet right there. There's other parasitoids that'll actually thread that ovipositor in through the bark into the larvae, sting the larvae and lay eggs inside the larvae and kill them that way as well. Now, what's interesting is we have insects native to this country that are attacking emerald ash borer as well. Why? Because they're used to attacking other agralis insects. In other words, native insects that attack hackberry, oak, and birch in this country that are kind of close cousins to the emerald ash borer, except native to this continent rather than Asia. And some of them have found that, hey, these are an ash. I'll start attacking them too. And they'll do it. You can see that's the overwintering chamber in there, but guess what? There was a dead insect in there, kind of a small husk. Why? Because parasitoids did their job. They tend to do a better job on thin bark trees because they have to thread that ovipositor in. Rougher bark, they have difficulty being able to find them and be able to get that ovipositor in there unless it's a very fractured bark. There are a lot of fissures to it that they can work that ovipositor down to. Other natural enemies, predators. As I mentioned, woodpeckers can take out about 30%. So you might say, well, if we got the parasitoids working and we've got the predators working, we've just eliminated maybe half the population. But again, that's just going to slow the increase. It's not going to be a declining population, not at a 50% loss. Well, what about winter cold? Wouldn't that be nice? You know, we always pride ourselves on our cold winters killing things. Unfortunately, emerald ash bore's from an area that has a similar climate to ours, a little bit milder, but nevertheless fairly close. When we've gone through and looked at it, and yes, we do have overwintering mortality. That does happen. But we only have 5% die at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It takes 90 to lose 99%, takes a minus 30, and that's temperature beneath the bark. And it's going to have to be like minus 35 for a while to get that cold to penetrate, particularly into a large tree. So unfortunately, we do not have it cold enough, long enough to kill a significant proportion of the larvae. 2019, it was fairly cold. We did have some really cold spells, and that helped slow the population growth. This year, no, we didn't have enough cold at all. In fact, it barely got to minus 10 a couple times, which means we had almost no overwintering mortality this year from emerald ash borer. And that, so the population is actually going to increase at an increasing rate this year. Well, what can we do? Well, we can treat valuable ash trees. You know, the cost has plummeted from what they had in the early 2000s. But I will say only if emerald ash borer is found within 15 miles of your location or within your county. And so right now it's Minnehaha and Lincoln County. And if you have an ash tree in those counties and you like it, it's time to start treating it. And if you're at the edge of those counties, for example, at the eastern edge of Minnehaha County, for example, yeah, you might want to start treating because you may be within 15 miles of Sioux Falls. But if you live in Rapid City or Aberdeen or Yankton or that, it's premature to treat. We haven't found it there yet. And you might say, but you're not going to find the first one. And you're absolutely right. But even if the tree has been attacked for a year or two, it can be treated and be brought back. So we do want people out there looking for this insect, but you don't need to go out there and just treat because it may be coming soon. Wait till it's arrived and we've confirmed it. There are lots of very, very effective treatments. I will say all the treatments that are effective for mature trees are available to commercial applicators, not to homeowners. So if you got a nice ash tree and you want to keep it, it's best to hire someone to do these treatments. But there's chemjet systems that are available. There's rainbow systems, low pressure plugless system that an operator will put around the tree. There's also ArborJet, which is a high pressure plug system. And there's the Wedgel, which doesn't even require a drill to push it in. But all these systems are done by commercial applicators. And so you should hire someone to come out and treat your tree. I will say too, there are also soil treatments that can be done. The communities that have been infested by emerald ash borer have discouraged this. They would rather have the chemical go into the tree rather than the soil. So while there are very effective soil treatments out there, by and large, you're going to find in South Dakota, most communities are going to say, no, we prefer that the chemical be put in the tree rather than the soil around it. Well, what about the best injection early, just after the tree leaves out? You also want it fairly low on the trunk and very shallow. Just as the leaves are starting to open is the best time to start treating. And in fact, right now, this week, sunny weather, warm weather, soils are moist, boom, treat these trees. in the area where we have emerald ash borer, because you'll get that the water is going to be pulled up very easily by the expanding leaves. And if you remember what I mentioned, if you put the chemical in right now, it's going to go into the leaves too. And you'll kill mom as she's feeding on the leaves before she lays eggs. That's great. And for any mom that lands on the tree and lays eggs without feeding on the leaves to that tree that was treated, once the eggs hatch, they're going to be killed at a very small stage. And so you're not going to get any damage. You bet you can inject these trees in July and August, but think of it, they've done a lot of damage by then. It's best to have them treat in the spring, from when the leaves first come out till about mid or late June is the ideal window to treat. And it can be done every other year. So it's not an annual treatment for these treatments that are injected in the tree. It's every 2 years. And you're not gonna have to do it every 2 years forever. But really for about 5 times, for about 10 years, you need to do that. And then we can slow it down thereafter. So again, do them low. That way the chemicals evenly distribute through the canopy. Do them shallow. This was one by luck, was cut down by the city of Sioux Falls. And you can see here, they drilled far too deep. You just have to go just beneath the bark into that sapwood. And that's where we want to put all the chemical. And make sure it's done right. If you're in Sioux Falls, there is a list of applicators on the City of Sioux Falls website. Certainly encourage everyone to go to that site in Sioux Falls, Canton area, and decide who they want to have treated from there. Right now, the cost is about $10 a diameter inch. So you measure your tree at about 4.5 feet above the ground. If it's 10 inches in diameter, not circumference, it's going to cost you about $100. Now, again, it may be a little higher than that in some cases, or a little lower than that in some cases, but it gives you kind of a ballpark figure. And when we looked at quotes for removing trees or keeping trees, in other words, I'm going to remove your tree or I'm going to inject your tree, and I compared about 225 quotes for the same trees. Found that if the tree is larger than 20 inches in diameter, in other words, it's a big, healthy ash tree, more than 20 inches, it's going to take 25 years of treatments to equal the cost of removing it right now, in general, big tree in a backyard. Now think of that. It's going to take 25 years before those two lines cross. In other words, it makes absolute sense to treat those trees. You're going to treat them every other year for about 10 years, 5 times. And then you're going to do it maybe 3 times or 4 times the next decade. And then you're going to do it 1 time thereafter. And that because the population of ash will decline, so the population of borers will decline. So you're not going to be attacked by as many at a single moment. And that, so on those mature, healthy ash trees, where you've got that shade now and you're not going to see it if you remove it, for homeowners, it makes sense to begin treating. Now, if the tree is less than 10 inches, no, it's going to cost almost nothing to cut these trees down. And think of it, you now just inherited lifetime care for this tree. So on trees that are less than 10 inches, my recommendation is just cut them down, plant something else in its place other than a maple. We've got far too many maples out there right now. And I always fear another insect coming from Asia, more than the Asian longhorn beetle, could take those out. And in many communities, 1/3 of their trees are maples. So we need to go on a maple diet too. But plant something else in its place. It's under 10. If it's between 10 and 20, well, that's a toss-up. In some cases, you're going to say, you know what, it's worth it to keep that tree. And others, you'll say, nah, I'll just remove it. And then the trees you don't want, start removing them. They're doing that in Sioux Falls. City of Sioux Falls has done an aggressive and excellent plan to do this. Yankton is already in the process of doing this. A number of other communities are well. Brookings is. It makes sense. Emerald ash borer is going to appear in all our communities eventually. And when it does, it's going to kill all the ash trees that aren't being treated. And so if you start thinning the populations now, since we have, 1/3 of our canopy ash, might as well start get ahead of it. Start cutting now rather than waiting until it arrives. as they did here. They removed every ash except the ones that they're going to treat. All right, made absolute sense. Well, a couple of reminders. If you're in Lincoln, Minnehaha, or Turner County, you're within our quarantine. In other words, you can't move any hardwood firewood. All right, doesn't matter what's an oak or a maple or an ash. The reason being is most people can't identify it. So the state just says any firewood or raw ash products such as ash chips, ash logs. None of that can be removed out of those counties at any time of the year, period. So nothing can move out. The reason being is if someone cuts down an ash tree during the wintertime and emerald ash borer is in it, hauls that log somewhere else, the adults will still emerge from it this summer. And if someone cut down an ash tree a few weeks ago and ran it through a chipper, those pupae can survive and come out as adults still. So we've got kind of a window there. You can't move anything through it. Now that's often confused with the city of Sioux Falls ban on the removal and pruning of ash within the city during the summer. And the reason they did that is they didn't want anything being moved during the flight period and moving it around the town a little bit faster. But that's different from the quarantine that the state's put in place. That's county-wide quarantines. Every time we find an insect in a county, that county is quarantined. Wood cannot move out it. Why? Because we want to slow the spread of this insect across the state. And remember, they can survive chipping right now. You go out there during that big storm we just had in eastern South Dakota and you cut down some ash trees, some big rotted ash fell, and chip them up and haul those chips to another county, you've just moved the insect. In fact, you move those chips to another town in the county, you may have just moved the insect to another community. Chip it locally, use it locally, or haul the wood to the landfill for proper disposal. And what if we do nothing? We just sit back and say, well, we'll do like Dutch elm disease, just let the trees die. It's not the same thing. Dutch elm disease is a slow killer. Dutch elm disease showed up in Brookings County in, I think, 1970. I was still cutting down infested elms on campus 5 years ago, and now we started treating the ones that are left. It takes a long time to kill them. Emerald ash borer tends to kill all the ash in a population within about 10 years. So cities are going to be overwhelmed with removals. And if they leave them standing dead, they fall over. I took this picture in New York, and this is a woods where obviously nobody's cutting the trees. And all those trees you're looking at that aren't really budding out in the center, those are all standing dead ash. And in all these woodlots, they're just falling over now. What happens is the roots are gone. Why? The roots gone because the roots essentially starved. And so on any of these, we do have to get the trees down. As soon as they start to die from being infested, they need to be removed. Otherwise, they become very unpredictable and can just fall at the slightest whim. They don't even need much of a wind or a wind at all. Well, I certainly appreciate you listening to this for about the last 50 minutes. I kind of tried to cover every aspect of emerald ash borer in South Dakota. Other states will find slight differences in biology and symptoms to it. And by biology, I mean life cycle. But I'll stop right here. And if there's any questions, Tony, let me know.
I have seen no questions in the chat box. If anybody in attendance has any questions, feel free to unmute your microphone and ask away.
Or maybe I've done a darn good job of explaining it, or everybody's heard this before. It certainly shouldn't have been a new thing to people. But if we don't have any questions, I do have my contact information down here on this last slide. Feel free to email me or text me. You can certainly contact Tony as well in Rapid City area, and I think he's got his information up there somewhere. Or any of your foresters, if you go to our South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources website and go down to forestry, you'll find foresters throughout the state that can help you take a look at your trees to determine whether or not they're infested. However, I probably should say this: if you're in the city of Sioux Falls, there's no need to call to see if your tree is infested. If it's not infested, it's going to be infested within the next year or so. So city of Sioux Falls, no. If you've got an ash tree, either remove it or treat it. No one needs to come by and look and see if it's infested yet. If you're in Aberdeen, Watertown, Yankton, Pierre, yeah, give us a call. We'll be happy to take a look.
Dr. Ball had one question pop up. What will the impact be on rural Black Hills?
In the Black Hills, it's going to go a little slower in the forested area because ash is a minor component found along rivers and streams in the Black Hills. So I don't expect to see a major impact there at all in the forest. The Black Hills communities along the edge, Rapid City, Spearfish, and that, they've diversified a little bit more than other communities, the eastern part of our state. But nevertheless, there's still a lot of ash out there, a lot in the campground areas for sturgis, for example. And so it's going to be a major headache for those communities as well, though a lot of them are also doing preemptive. They're out there harvesting the trees. The natural riparian forests in eastern South Dakota that are lined with ash, that's where we're probably going to see the major impact from a natural standpoint, because those trees are going to be falling in streams and rivers. But since it's not a major component to the Black Hills, its impact will be much less noticed.
Great, thank you. And I have one final question here before we wrap up. Is the rate of emerald ash borer movement across the state the same as you predicted now for the last couple of years?
Actually, it's slower than what I thought it would be. And, the only pattern we were able to look at is from some other states, and also looking at Dutch elm disease and how quickly that moved throughout the state. It took about 20 years, but we're coming up to the 5th year, which will be next year, 2023. And by that time, I fully expected that we would have a number of counties in the southeastern part of our state having infestations in them. So I've got 1 year to go, I guess you could look at it that way. But right now the spread is fairly slow. But as I say, this is kind of a stealth. It can be in trees for 2 years before anyone even notices it. So my guess is we probably have more counties impacted than what we know. It's just the infestations are fairly small. But yes, it is, the movement appears to be slower than what I anticipated.
All right. Well, with that, we'll wrap up here. Thank you, Dr. Ball, for your time. Thank you for all our guests for your time as well. One more reminder, if you have not done so already and you wish to attain Society of American Forester or International Society of Arboriculture certifications, please put your credential information in the chat box before you leave the meeting. I'll leave the meeting open here for a couple more minutes. Stay tuned and join us next month where Dr. Ball will discuss scale insects in South Dakota. A registration email will be sent out in the coming week or so here. So stay tuned for that next episode in our Forest Health Workshop, and have a great day.